Alright guys, welcome back. So on today's episode, we're going to separate the transmission from the engine, put the engine on the stand and tear it apart, see what we got. It's basically just a bone stock 289 other than the aluminum intake and a 4-barrel. This engine was spec'd originally to have a 4-barrel in the Galaxie. And like anybody else that comes in possession of a 289, we'll just assume it's a LOPO until we find out it's not. So the transmission, the C4, it was introduced in like '64. There are a few different versions of them. I'm not going to pretend to have more knowledge than the wiki page on these things. I know they can be built to handle a ridiculous amount of power, but so can pretty much any other transmission. But I have a feeling this is, because it's a 65 and it's likely original, it may have been rebuilt. It's probably the weaker C4, which means it has a 24 spline input shaft. So that will be very easy to tell once we unbolt the torque converter, pull the transmission back, we'll pull the converter off the trans, and we'll just count the splines. I'm sure it's a 24 spline, which means it's the weaker one, which doesn't matter much, that you just replace all that stuff. When you build these things to handle power, you're gonna be replacing all that stuff anyway. So I don't even know if we're gonna be using the C4 platform in the Galaxie. I haven't actually made up my mind on the powertrain for this car yet. So, but for now, let's get the oil drained and get this thing unbolted. Well guys, we're gonna skip draining the transmission. I was trying to get the dipstick tube out, but I can't seem to break it loose. It'd be easier if it was still under the car, but so we'll just go ahead and unbolt the torque converter and pull the transmission back. So as you can see, I'm rotating the motor with a wrench on the crank and going into the starter hole to unbolt the torque converter bolts. Well guys, I got 2 off and 2 are just stripped out. I'm not reusing this torque converter or even this flex plate. I'm not even using this engine combination. I would just take my air cutoff wheel and come in here and zip those off. But I'm not going to waste the time to even do that. I'm just going to unbolt the transmission and slide it back, leaving the converter on the back of the flex plate. So this is a 6-bolt block, obviously because you have 6 bolts bolting the bell housing onto the rear of the block. The earlier 289s were 5-bolt. I do know it was around like 64.5. They went from the 5-bolt to the 6-bolt. They made them in all the different versions, including the LOPO. And our last 2. Now again, don't forget, we still have our torque converter is hooked up. So that's where trying to rush and being frustrated gets you. The bottom part of the dust shield it is a 2-piece. I had forgotten to take this off. So normally these things just slide out effortlessly if you can't unbolt the torque converter, because at that point nothing's really, it's just a spline holding it together. So, oh yeah, I forgot to take the bottom part of the dust cover off. And this is the part bolted to the transmission. So as you can see, our flex plate that's where I was pulling against it. But again, I'm not planning on using any of this. So my mind, it really isn't on task because we're just exploring what I've got here. There we go. See, just like that. And that's what should have happened the first time. All right, guys, so I counted already, and we have a 24 spline input shaft. So we have, of course, to no surprise, the early 64 to 69 C4 transmission. So now I'm going to work on getting the torque converter off so I can get the flex plate off and we can get our block on the stand. All right, guys, this may be a familiar sight. Let's see if we can get this to work. Well, that's always good to find floating around. Granted, it was between the flex plate and the block, but who knows? I don't know what that is. That was in there too. And that's the back of our block. Now, there's a lot of weird shaped metal things. You can kind of see some damage from at some point. Other than that, not too much to look at. I don't know if Dorman, I don't know if those were OEM or not. Probably. But anyway, guys, let's keep going. Well, guys, as you can see, I'm having a hard time finding correct hardware to make this work. This is some all thread. I have another piece right there and the nuts I need. We did luck out. The thread is a 7/16 by 14, and the original engine mount bolts are the right pitch. You can see that's what I had to do to make that one work. Ooh. Oh yeah. Perfect. All in the coolant galleys. Alright guys, so most of the time you turn the engine, you drain the oil, which I did already. flip the engine over, then pull the oil pan. I'm going to avoid that for the moment, just because if we flip it upside down, the motor hasn't ran in quite a while. So it's best, you know, it's a little extra work, but it's best to just drop it like this so that residual oil doesn't seep its way back up into the block when it's upside down, and then it's going to drip out everywhere. Because this thing hasn't been running in a while, so most of the oil is already down in the sump. But first, let's get this off. Nope, not a hypo. That's what I'm talking about. There's still, I don't know if you can see on the camera, there's still a ton of residual oil. That's high temp RTV. Ugh, it still smells fresh. High temp RTV on a cork gasket. I guess. All right, let's get this motor flipped over. Nothing's working. These are too long now. Screw it. All right, guys, we've got our new hardware installed, so now I can spin the motor over all the way. So guys, to no surprise, this is obviously not a hypo. This is just a regular run-of-the-mill 289. It was originally spec'd out to be a 4-barrel in the Galaxie. We'll go over the numbers and everything here in a minute. But as you can see, the casting number, this could have been, the block could have been designated to be a hypo engine. But all the hypo 289s and the regular 289s, the 6 bolts anyway, got the same casting number between 65 and most of 66, because what they did was they just hand selected certain motors for further inspection. You know, they would do magnafluxing and check for micro cracking, and they took the best blocks out of a batch to be designated to be hypo engines. The cranks are supposed to be nodular iron, supposed to be a little bit, some people say they're the same, some people say there's little differences. I don't really know. They would put orange paint on the counterweights, so it would help designate that this was a hypo crank. So that's something you would look forward to. Now that can wear off over the years as well. So as I've said, I'm not a subject matter expert on any of this stuff. One of the biggest things to look for are the main caps. As you can see on these, they're tapered inwards, which would designate these as non-hypo main caps. The connecting rods are more or less the same. Some people will say they're machined differently. Most of the time they're not. The only big difference is they ran 3/8 bolts instead of 5/16. In the caps, the rod cap is slightly different on the hypo engines. And because of that, there is a slight weight imbalance. So behind your counterweights, I believe the one behind the timing set, there's supposed to be a stamped steel counterweight to counteract the weight imbalance from the beefier hardware on the rods. To no surprise, we did not have hypo headers. We just had the regular ones. The cylinder heads, there is something else. I keep forgetting to double check for the sake of the video. I don't remember what the difference is on the cylinder heads, but it's obvious, it doesn't matter. This is not a hypo engine. So from what I could find, as far as the base 289s, there was a handful of different piston selections, of course, and that all would just determine on what compression the engine had. This, of course, like I mentioned, was the 4-barrel option, and it had slightly higher compression because it designated this car was supposed to run on premium fuel. This wasn't the lower compression 2V engine. This was the 4V, which is the Venturi 4-barrel. So I believe the compression on this one would be a little bit higher than your run-of-the-mill 2-barrel. The hypo 289s, of course, had a solid lifter valve train setup. This obviously does not. So that's a pretty easy thing to tell right there. So let's go over the particular numbers for the Galaxie and this engine. So the first number we see is the block casting. This is a block you would want to start with if you were going to make a hypo, like a clone, or just lie, or you did want to build a hypo to spec. If you got like main caps off the internet, you'd have to have it line board and everything anyway. But so we have, it's a C5AE 6015E. So C is the decade. That of course is the 60s. 5 is the year the block was cast. That would be 65. A is it means the engine was built for a Galaxie or just a forward full size. E is just the engine group. It's kind of just an engineering code, basically telling you this is an engine, if you didn't already know that. 6015 is more or less just part of the part number, telling you 6015 means this is a 289. And the last E on the end is like the revision. It's the version of this 289. So E would be like the 5th version of the 289. Don't forget, these blocks started life as 5 bolts, not 6. I believe this is the first version of the 6 bolt. It doesn't make that big of a difference. There was no issues one way or the other. The casting date is where things get a bit confusing. So we have a 5 alpha 6 or 5A6. So 5, of course, is again the year. A is the month, and 6 is the day. So 1965, because that coincides with the decade of the block casting. So 1965, A would be January, and 6 is January 6th. Now, when we flip the engine back over, I'll show you, we have the engine assembly date code in front of the left cylinder head or the right cylinder head, however you're looking at the engine. Now, that is A13, and then I believe there was like a C on the back side of it. I think that 4th number you can ignore. That's like the initials of the guy doing the assembly or something. Sometimes they're not on there. I might be mistaken on that, but I'm not 100% sure. So A, January 13, the 13th. So the block was cast on the 6th, and this motor was built as a 4V on the 13th of the same month. Now, that makes sense. That's all well and good. But the confusing part is this. On the car, we're not going to go over the whole VIN number of the car on today's episode. We're really just talking about the engine. The car was built January 11th. That's 2 days before the engine was put together. Now, I don't know how the assembly process worked back then. I don't know if the VIN number, surely a VIN number would exist because somebody ordered the car or they were just building this as a stock order. I don't know if the VIN number was generated first. I'm sure it was, so they knew what they were building. But as far as the date, January 11th, onto the VIN, I'm assuming that was the start of the assembly. So then that would make sense. And I don't know how long it would take Ford to build this car back then, but I know things back then were moving very fast. If you look at the numbers on the sales numbers from back then for Ford, really, it's insane. So like in the Ford community, the old guy Ford community with this old stuff, they go as far as telling you if you have an assembly date within like 6 months of your car's build date, it's likely the same engine. This was like 2 days, so but again, it's weird to me. It would make more sense if it was the other way around. You know, it's like, hey, this engine was built on the 11th and the car was built on the 13th, but I guess the engine was built for the car and the VIN started, you know, they designated the VIN number on the 11th and that's why it has the 11th. It might have taken a week to put one of these together back then. I don't know. They still had to paint it. I don't know. But I'm just assuming this is the original motor to this car. I don't have a reason to believe it's not. The whole automotive archaeology stuff, it's kind of interesting. That's why a lot of guys, they live and breathe this kind of stuff. They're always hunting down the rare stuff. Or even somebody trying to, you know, maybe somebody got a coupe or a fastback Mustang or a Falcon or whatever, and they're looking for a motor that would make sense. You know, that would be a period correct build for their car. Now, it's a little interesting on this block in particular. There's a few hand stamped markings
I don't know the importance or relevance of them. There's an R, a P, and a C, which are very clearly hand stamped, but there is kind of machine style stampings, a 5A1, and then there's a space, and there's a C. Again, I mean, we look at the 5A1R, January 1965, January 1st, but we're 5A6, 5A1, I don't know. I guess for the fun of it, we can flip the engine back over and pull a valve cover. Yeah, this is a very dry cylinder head. And 5A6, 1965. This is not a happy engine. This thing is cooked. Well, that's interesting. $4K1. I think K is November. So November 1st, 1964, if K is November, I think it is. So that's not too far off. That's kind of interesting. I have no reason to believe that's not the original cylinder head, though. It probably is. I mentioned earlier about the 6-week rule with these old Fords, and that's a bit more, though, because that's early November. It's about 8 weeks, 8 to 9 weeks. Schmutz. But anyway, guys, I am exhausted from various other reasons. We'll go ahead and call it an episode. I hope you enjoyed exploring this with me. And soon we're going to get the body off the frame and we'll figure out a lot of other things. But all right, I'll see you on the next one. Thanks for watching.